Good afternoon, folks. Wow, that's loud. I'm Stuart Pickett, and I'm here for a couple of reasons. One, I think Melanie is really cool, and I am so delighted they asked me to introduce her. And second, my thoughts that she's cool are reinforced by the fact, I guess, that I'm a past president of the ESA. Well, Dr. Melanie Okoro was born in Florida. She grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her environmental her environmental interests were started in some really wonderful situations, like her great-grandmother took her fishing. I think that's just a deep and wonderful root. One thing that I've been told to mention to you is that if you ever find yourself on a basketball court with Melanie, be sure you're on her team. She played in high school, and she got a basketball scholarship to Johnson C. Smith University, which is where she went to college in Charlotte, North Carolina. She was there mentored by Joseph Fail, who I think it's really appropriate to acknowledge the ancestors, so the people who get us on our way, like her great-grandmother and her college advisor, are definitely worth mentioning. She majored in marine biology there, and she got a Bachelor of Science in 2005. She then went on to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC, which is where I met her doing her PhD work there. And she did work that was associated with the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, which I also have something to do with. And Peter Groffman was her mentor in that. Melanie published 5 papers from her PhD, and I'm not going to tell you how many more that is than I did. She then went to work for NOAA, where she managed water quality and invasive species work all around in many places in the country. She has been for a long time a real promoter of diversity in science and ecology. And she's actually published in that area and has a lot of activities, which I won't really go into here. She is the founder and a principal of Eco Alpha Environmental and Engineering Services, which is located in Sacramento. So I am so delighted to welcome Melanie to the stage to talk about environmental interactions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pickett. I brought back some old memories, some fun ones and some tough ones. And I also like to thank Dr. Naima Harris for inviting me here today. Today I'm going to talk about a change that's going to come. As ecologists, we make observations and analysis about the world around us, interactions between the ecosystem, species, and their environment. We also examine policy implications of the work that we do every day. What I've often found is that our ability to communicate and be successful in the space is our ability to see from various perspectives, to gain insight from others, to develop outcomes that are not only going to be economically beneficial, they're going to be beneficial to the society as well as our environment. So today I'm going to share with you my perspective on the role of ecology in the private and public sector. But I'm going to focus through the lens of environmental compliance. Now, we've all had those moments when our fundamental understanding of the world around us either changes or shifts. Now, for me, this moment was when I realized that good old Saint Nick and Santa Claus, he wasn't real. He was indeed a folkloric figure. Right? So there's a widely held belief that Santa Claus is a prominent symbol of the Christmas holiday. And I can laugh at it now, given what I now know. But if you can imagine for me, if you will, what it felt like as a child to realize that Santa Claus wasn't real. Imagine the moment that my perspective changed. Now, we all know that you might get some Christmas presents if you stay on that naughty or nice list. Turns out, my twin sister and I, we would receive the same type and number of gifts every year and open them on the same day. Prior to me realizing that good old St. Nick wasn't real, no observations had really changed. Only my understanding and my perception of reality. I had indeed experienced, at a young age, what is considered a paradigm shift. A paradigm is a term that's closely associated with the controversy as well as the excitement of science. It often evokes some radical new idea or revolutionary idea. And since the publication of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution, paradigm shifts are a central theme in ecology. Now today, you most often hear the term paradigm shift with respect to a radical disruption or an upheaval in the economy. I want us to take, for example, DoorDash, which is a radical paradigm shift from how we deliver food today, right? So DoorDash decided to repurpose itself, become more cloud-based, individually operated, and decentralized. You'll also see this shift in other companies like Uber, who have revolutionized the taxi service industry. Also in other thriving companies out there like Thumbstack, where at the click of a button, you can have a handyman come to your door, right? So you make the decisions. Or you might often hear the term paradigm shift described as thinking outside of the box, as if to say we need to have a radical shift here. I believe that more properly understood, in the public and private sector, we need paradigm shifts in order to solve some of the world's most complex environmental problems at multiple temporal and spatial scales. Think deforestation, climate change, as well as overharvesting of our threatened endangered fish populations. Why is this imperative? It's imperative that we have a paradigm shift to solve some of these complex global issues because we know the cost of not doing so. EPA estimates that they spend approximately $5 billion a year with fees, with fines, trying to ensure that there's proper environmental compliance. One of the things that we do know is that no matter whether you're an ecologist, a restoration scientist, a biologist, an indigenous global leader, it's important for you to understand the cost of compliance, not just in an economic sense, with respect to the work that you do in an ecological and societal sense. What this means is that managers, scientists, stakeholders are going to have to be well equipped with the skills in order to move the science forward. And so that requires a paradigm shift. We know that many of the projects that we work on a day-to-day basis have competing interests. There are stakeholder obligations that have to be met. There are synergies and collaborations that happen every day. But what I found to know is that without understanding the paradigm of the stakeholders that you're working with, gaining insight from them, and then understanding how to communicate that with the communities that you serve, how can you implement a successful project? Seemingly as important as needing to have a paradigm shift in the way that we interact and engage with stakeholders is making sure that we have a diverse community of stakeholders that's involved in the process. One of the key issues that we've identified time and time again when working with private and public stakeholders is that every individual team believes that they have their own privileged perspective. Now, there are a couple issues with that. If my goal is to improve habitat in the Russian River, however, there is a dam that's blocking passage for salmonids and is used for water storage and floodplain protection, there might be some competing interests there. And so there are resource managers involved in that process. There are fisheries biologists that are involved in that process that all have many competing interests. So it's important for us to identify the paradigms that drive their mission and their vision, and understand their obligations. These two really go hand in hand. Being able to see the world in a very different perspective. One of the most important aspects of the work that we do is that oftentimes we have data and information. That data and information might not change, but our perspective and how we understand it does, all right? Again, a powerful aspect of a paradigm shift is that, quite frankly, you don't need to be disruptive in the space, right? You don't need to come up with some idea that is going to move one from the status quo. You simply need to understand the perspectives of the stakeholders that you are working with. In science, paradigms are everywhere, right? And what we know with paradigms is that they do shift, and they happen over and over and over again. So the change is going to be inevitable. This really is a great reminder that our current state of understanding can go through radical shifts. That if we're not seeing our projects through the lens of our stakeholders, we're minimizing our effectiveness in that process. One might believe that their way of doing things is the best way. That centered belief that I have that Santa Claus was real, I no longer believe that anymore because I see it from a very different perspective. Interestingly enough, We see these paradigms play out in the public and private projects that we work on every day. Think the paradigm shift to selective fisheries for Pacific salmon in the Pacific Northwest, or the growing prevalence of dam removal in California. These cases and others are classic paradigm shifts in the way that we think about managing our trust resources and provides new insights on considerations for restoration as well as sustainability. I want to talk today about an example of a public and private partnership that was extremely successful in California. That is the San Clemente Dam removal on the Carmel River. No longer are major infrastructure projects like dams, bridges, and railways are seen solely through the lens of utility. Their environmental impacts have to be evaluated, understanding the public safety risk, as well as how to develop and remove them. So in the summer of 2015, during a long planning process and 3 years of deconstruction, the San Clemente Dam was removed. This is the largest dam removal project in California. This project is vitally important. It brought together partnerships from organizations such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA Fisheries, as well as the California Coastal Conservancy. This is a story of a classic paradigm shift. Today, the Carmel River is free-flowing with 25 miles of habitat that is accessible to salmonids for rearing and spawning habitat. The sediment flows freely down to the Carmel beach, and the public safety issues are now resolved. What's more important is that when an individual sits now in this space 15 years from now, they will never know that the dam was there. This paradigm shift was critical. It was critical to bring partners together, stakeholders at the federal and state level, to think about how can we remove the dam? But more importantly, how can we think about the long-term ecological impacts, the environmental, as well as the recreational benefits? Again, there was more at stake than just thinking about their environmental obligation. There was more to consider. Today, the Carmel River is what we call rewilding. The valley is finding itself. The river is flowing freely. Salmon have passage up into the headwaters, and it is an amazing place for people alike to enjoy. But one thing it also suggests is that there are aspects of perspectives that we just might not have been aware of. That is to say that, again, not one individual team has that privileged perspective. It's imperative, in particular, when working on these types of projects, that we open up our mind, that we evolve our ideas into a new standard. Hold too closely to one paradigm, and the world might change under your feet. Or identify new opportunities, and you can change the world. For the societies represented here today, there are even more implications for why it's vitally important to have a paradigm shift. Well, we know the reasons for a diverse and inclusive community. It's a moral thing to do. It's a good thing to do. But inherently, when you build a diverse and inclusive environment, you inherently become better. You'll be able to identify the changes that will need to be made and develop the leaders that can help build and optimize teams to move the society forward. I've really come to appreciate the power of a diverse stakeholder group and team. I've seen firsthand the value that it can have, and it can grow societies and organizations. Interestingly enough, some of the paradigm shifts that we've talked about today are deeply rooted in conservation ecology. And there are nodes and linkages to ecology all throughout the work that we do. I've had an opportunity to interact as well as engage with some of the largest environmental and engineering companies. And they employ some of the best and some of the brightest. But what I believe is that they found real value in working with our organization because we take a look from a different lens. We bring new ideas, fresh new ideas, and we help develop solutions that are going to be sustainable for all. One key aspect that I want to share with you today, really if you don't take anything home with you, is that remember that the teams that you're working in have no privileged perspective, right? Not one individual team that you're working in. You're going to have to collaborate with stakeholders, groups, maybe some politicians, individuals that you might not see eye to eye with. But it will take you as leaders to take a step back, to identify the paradigms of the stakeholders that you're working with, build those teams to find those solutions, and then be able to communicate that to the group that you're working with. One thing I will tell you is that you as leaders play a very important role in the ecological community, in the shift that it will take to change others' perceptions. There are three sort of key elements that I like to think about when I'm working in this space. One, that we're all working with the same set of data that we see in a multitude of ways. That real perspective shifts can be powerful. Again, if you think business, think DoorDash. If you're an ecologist like myself and you always think about shifts in theories, know that paradigm shifts are powerful and they have the ability to really change the world and make impact. And that the paradigm shifts, they can and will happen. So what I'd like for you to do is to abandon the view that you have the one true perspective when you're working in the public and the private sector. What I hope that you do is take a step back, look at the problem from the lens of others. But this work actually has to be deliberate. The shift and the change will come, but you have to be open and considerate to others' perspectives. You have to understand that there are other viewpoints that are out there that can be as equally valid and/or superior as yours. So today, I invite you to look at problems with the different perspectives. But in that, I'd like for you to challenge yourself to elevate the narrative on what it means to work with diverse communities, with different backgrounds and perspectives to solve some of the world's most challenging problems. And in that, I'd like to say thank you.
All right, so that was amazing. Can we give a round of applause again? So I haven't formally greeted you at the conference yet. I am Dr. Naima Harris. I'm the program chair for the conference. I'm also an associate professor in the School of Environment at Yale University. So this is our time to reflect. This is our time to challenge our own paradigms. This is a time for us to scrutinize what we think we know about ecology, its application in this context in the private and public sector. It's an opportunity for us to rethink the impact of our work. It's a time for us to also take advantage of the expertise that we have in the room from our plenary speaker and ask some questions. So there are 2 mics that are in the center of the room. Feel free to come up and ask any questions that you have. I am going to take the liberty, some executive power here, and ask the first question. So, in thinking about this paradigm shift, and thinking about these different perspectives that we have, and that there's different perspectives that we're bringing to the table, does that also suggest or imply that to these environmental problems, there are also multiple solutions?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, but it depends, right? So, one of the most interesting things that I found in working with various stakeholders, again, and I've talked about this, is that there are often competing obligations, right? We have an entity that is focused on natural resource management, another entity that is a regulatory hammer, and they all have their own interest. But that doesn't mean that we all can't sit down at the table and discuss solutions to the problem. And those solutions don't always come in a nicely and neat package. And there are oftentimes multiple solutions implemented over time, okay? And so, one of the biggest aspects of working in this sector is communicating, one, that we're all here at the table for a reason. We're here to come up with effective solutions, and at different times in the process, they might benefit one stakeholder over the next, and it's going to happen over time. Another example of that is that San Clemente project. I had a colleague work on that project for 20 years, and retired right after the dam came down. So again, it definitely implies that there are multiple solutions to the problem and multiple outcomes as well, right? So that's really important.
Thank you. So we'll go here first.
Thank you for your, am I on? Thank you for your talk this afternoon. I think it's created a really nice space for some discussion. So my name is Caroline Ridley. I've been in the public sector for about 10 years now. And I was interested in, from your experience, whether, and this is going to bring together several themes, I think, from your talk. So you spoke of one sort of rewilding effort or removal of built infrastructure, and I'm wondering in your experience whether those kinds of projects are subject to the same, level of scrutiny, like in terms of environmental impact statements, that sort of thing, as newly built infrastructure. And sort of my second question is, what do you think could be better about some of those processes that surround infrastructure removal projects to ensure that diverse perspectives are addressed?
Sure, and I might ask you to say that last part again. I'm going to try to remember.
Okay, yeah.
So the first part about these types of infrastructure projects being heavily scrutinized. They're heavily scrutinized, very controversial, requires really strong communication with the stakeholder early on in the process. And understanding that at times during that process, that interaction with the stakeholder community might be going well, and other times it might not, right? But the goal is to stay the course in order to see these types of projects through. These projects are governed by a number of different factors. Some are, for example, we currently work on one of the largest mega transportation projects in the history of the US, and that is the California high-speed rail, right? With all of its controversy that comes with it and the stakeholders that are involved in it, this project is heavily scrutinized at many different levels, not only the state, but the federal, specifically because of the dollars that are a part of this process and where they come from. So again, I think that for these types of infrastructure projects, whether they be a high-speed rail project or the removal of a dam or a bridge, what is important to note that there has to be early engagement and involvement of all of the stakeholders, communities that the potential project might touch. And really, there might be, in essence, stakeholders that are important more than some. Throw that out of the window. Bring everybody to the table and work your way through the process. Because what we found is that if you do not, this process will be longer, become more controversial, and quite frankly, that's not the outcome that we want to see. And I'm sorry, was there a second piece to your question?
You pretty much hit
Okay.
it. I was interested in knowing sort of what about the process of sort of that scrutiny that these infrastructure projects, include. What about the process is sort of doing well in terms of incorporating diverse perspectives? What can we do better?
Right.
So I heard early engagement for sure, and I totally, in my experience, that is super, super important and doesn't always happen.
Yeah. But that's in the early stages of the project. So I'll continue the conversation, right? So in the early stages of the process, identifying your key stakeholders are going to be important. Identifying a consistent communication plan for your interaction and engagement, but be very clear about what you see their role is in the process, and then take a step back and ask them, how would they like to be a part of the process, right? Would they simply like to provide their advice and expertise? Would they like to be involved only in, for example, phase one, sort of understanding the impacts of the project to their constituents, to their environment, to their particular group, right? Really, in the second phase of a project, a transportation project, you're talking about implementation, right? So how do you continue to engage those groups, continue to communicate with those groups, identify and then determine what are going to be the most important aspects that they're going to be concerned about, right? Reach out to them, again, early and consistently, right? This is really important. One thing I want to say about the science is that the data will be there. The tracking, the monitoring associated with that, the regulatory compliance, so for example, environmental impacts reports that actually have to be done. Figure out how to communicate what's actually in those reports back to the communities that you're serving, right? Because again, as we talked about, the data will be there. It will not change. It will be the leaders who can communicate that information back to the communities that are going to make it powerful and actually more successful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Was there a question over here?
Hi, I'm Alyssa Starry from Portland State.
Hi, Alyssa.
I want to thank you, Dr. Harrison, for being here and sharing with us today. I'm obviously a huge fan of your work. And I want to continue the dialogue a little bit on the diversity piece. And I just want to start by also thanking you for being open to discussion about this. I have heard some people say, or I really got your message about the importance of working on these projects with diverse teams of people. But I have heard people say, I just don't know how to put a diverse group together. There just isn't, we just don't have that training in my discipline or in my field. And so I'm wondering what your response would be to those people who feel challenged to diversify their work.
Why I have to take a step back and say, Alyssa and I went to graduate school together. So she's not a big fan, she's just a friend who's asking a really great question.
I was trying to keep that on the down low.
So, one of the first things that I would say is that it's okay to not know, right? To come to the realization that you might not have all of the answers, but also understand that sort of where your role is in that place. Is it your responsibility to have all of those answers? Or is it your responsibility to be a part of the team that continues to challenge the unknowledged assumptions, right? So finding your place and your role is probably the most important aspect, right? And I always say, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So there are other organizations out there that do this really well. They facilitate and bring together teams to help organizations figure it out, right? And that might just simply be the first start. But again, acknowledging that you don't know and then identifying your role in the process is probably going to be key. And again, I always say that you just have to keep the narrative alive. You can't let it go by the wayside just because it is difficult. By nature, the work that we do, it's inherently difficult. So you just simply have to persevere in that. There will be challenges and there will be roadblocks, but again, you can seek out the help that you need to guide you in the process the right way. You do not have to take it on by yourself. As a team, as a research group, as a university, as an organization.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Rents. I work for the Nature Conservancy. And we often talk about projects moving at the speed of trust, but we're also often in ecology facing all of these issues that feel really super urgent. We have to deal with climate change now, this decade. After that, it's too late. And I think sometimes there's a temptation to skip over these early stakeholder steps because we feel we don't have time to do that. So I was wondering if you have some specific examples of times where skipping over that step made the process longer, like you alluded to, and times when incorporating that step was done really well.
Absolutely. I can think about the recovery of one of my favorite fisheries in the Pacific Northwest, which is the coho salmon. So we were charged, the NOAA fisheries team, we were charged with writing a recovery plan for coho. And it required quite a few stakeholders to sit at the table, indigenous leadership, as well as many others. And during that initial process, we were a team of biologists with good intentions, right? We cared about the species. We thought we knew everything about it. And we were going to write this amazing recovery plan, which is essentially a guide in how other state agencies or private entities should go about the conservation and protection and recovery of threatened and endangered species. Well-intentioned. I was a part of that group. And we put out a draft recovery plan. And boy, oh boy, did we have so many comments. I could have spent the next 2 years addressing all of them. And one of the things that we found was that we had not seen recovery of coho salmon through the lens of the communities that would be impacted the most. And we paid a price for that. What do I mean by that? We saw salmon populations, coho specifically, decline rapidly over the next 3 years while we're writing a plan to recover the species. So that really hit home for me. That happened early on in my career with NOAA. And for me, again, it was a paradigm shift to say that we need to think outside of the box, and that we need to bring more stakeholders to the table early on in the process. Because quite frankly, we need to get collective buy-in to implement this recovery plan that we've written, that we worked so hard on, that we're very proud of. But quite frankly, if it sits on the shelf and nobody implements it, it's not going to be a success. So that was a time for me when I knew that we needed to have a different perspective so that we can have some different outcomes. Now, I sit on the council as a small business representative for the California High-Speed Rail. And boy, oh boy, do we have to communicate a lot with stakeholders, right? I'm an advocate for small businesses in the space, and it's vitally important that they hear the impacts that this infrastructure project will have for small businesses in California. And we have long conversations about what those impacts might be, whether or not the rail will be able to help us in our greenhouse gas emissions, what this means to transport populations from one part of the state to the next. But quite frankly, it has been one of the best processes that I've been in. One, because everyone sits at the table. No matter if they decide to raise their hand and give their advice or consult, at least they're at the table, right? At least when an issue that arises that affects them as well as their constituents, they can identify it, and if they choose so, address it, but they have the choice, and that's important. And so this process, if you're not familiar with it, is a very controversial process. It requires a continual commitment to work in this space. It has implications not only for infrastructure, but economically in the state and environmental as well. And so there are many facets to this project, which actually makes it exciting, and it makes it revolutionary. And so this, for me, is a great initial case study of how it should be done.
Hi,
Question over here.
my name is Aaliyah Griffith. I'm a third-year PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill. First things first, thank you so much for your talk. But I did want to touch back on the diversity piece. When it comes to being on these EDI committees and different teams and even getting involved with nonprofits, how do you deal with potential burnout and feeling that you want to be involved with change and with helping your community, but being completely exhausted throughout the process?
If I can be candid, don't exhaust yourself. You can't say yes to everything, right? One thing that I have learned is that you just have to be selective about the projects that you work on, the advocacy that you want to support, and just be passionate about it. There will always be a cause to support. There are many that I would like to support, but there are some that I am more passionate about in others, and I focus my time and effort on those. And that's the advice that I would give to you, to not be overwhelmed by all of the choices that you have, but consider the ones that are going to be fruitful for you and impactful for you.
Right. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm Mark from the Dutch Research Institute for Sea Research. And I was a question for you about polarization that can happen in these kinds of processes with stakeholders. For example, in the Netherlands, we have very pressing environmental issues on, well, it doesn't really matter, nitrogen deposition. But because of this, the decision to cut down these depositions was taken very rapidly without stakeholder considerations, and as a result we have massive protests all over the country, and it's very difficult to get the genie back in the bottle, I would say, to get parties back to the table, especially because from both sides it's gotten a bit violent. So there's also a bit a question on who has the authority. Should we still talk to certain parties that might be representative of impacted stakeholders but have chosen a, well, quite extremist path at the moment? And I was wondering if you just experienced any similar polarization in the projects that you described, because they also seemed like they impacted a lot of people, and how you keep people at the table.
That's a really tough question. Interestingly enough, it happens quite often, right? The role that we play, and I say we as a resource manager or a scientist in this process, is to make sure that we have data that's uncompromised, right? And then hopefully as scientists, we can then translate that information to those polarizing parties in a way that they can understand. I don't know of any other way to do that and then allow time to take its course. One thing that's been very steadfast in the projects that I've worked on is to always stay the course. There will be upheaval and controversy on projects, and then they will die down, right? You'll find that. And then they will arise again. You'll find that. And then they will die down again. So there's a cyclic process to it. Again, identifying your role is to simply stay the course, make your observations, identify what's important to communicate in your science, and to persevere. Because if to stop would be to give up, right? And to raise your hands, as if these things will not happen. They will, and they're going to happen. How do we deal with opposition on projects? We trust in our partners and constituents that do this work every day to guide the process. What we provide is the consultation to say that this is the science, this is what it means, and this will be the impact, right? And we provide that information to them in a way that they understand, and then we allow them to make those policy decisions. It depends on whether you want to be intimately involved in the process or sort of externally removed from it, but they're really par for the course in working on controversial projects. So again, I don't think that there's a really great answer that I have for it, other than I never let my science be compromised. I consult and I advise, and I trust in the partners that we're working with, that they can help move my message forward.
Yes, thank you for your answer. I just wish that our own government would think a bit more in these steps sometimes. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we are starting to run out of time. I'm just checking to see if there's any last burning questions before I ask my last burning question. That was a way to say, don't ask your last burning question. Let me ask my last burning question. Okay, so my last burning question for you is, you built a company with your partner, expertise in ecological systems and ecology, expertise with engineering, and a bunch of other disciplines involved in your work. So my question for you is, how do you think about which projects you say no to? How do you think about the morals, the value, the impact that you want to have in your own branding, in your own work, in your own reputation? Which projects do you say no to? What are the criteria for selection?
In the early stages, I didn't have a criteria.
I figured.
I worked on projects that came to me, and I worked on them with an intensity to make sure that, again, it just goes back to, I just wanted to make sure that I was giving the best advice that I could based on the information that I had, right? And over time, that is recognized by your peers, by your colleagues, other companies hear about the work. And then you begin to identify projects that you want to work on. For me, one of the first projects was working with the Department of Boating and Waterways on aquatic weed invasion in the Delta, the San Francisco Bay Delta. And it all stemmed from invasion of these aquatic invasives because they were impacting the habitat for salmonids, right? So that was something that I was passionate about, right? So that was sort of one of my criteria. I moved into the space that I knew. And the one space that I felt extremely comfortable with was water and fish. And I continue to stay in that space today, although we run a company with now 100 employees in it. I still can't stay away from it. So that's one of the criterias that I have. I like fish and I like water, so I tend to stay with it. But another important criteria is that I tend to work with organizations that have the respect of the scientific and research community, whether they're private or public, right? I can make that decision and I can choose. And because I have that criteria, I very much enjoy working on the projects that we're on right now, working on the teams, learning from the teams that we're working on, and having what we believe is significant impact. And for a small business to have significant impact in this space is game-changing for us. Yeah.
So I think my last burning question was good. So once again, can we thank Dr. Okoro? Thank you so much for being here. I would certainly encourage everyone to do a little bit of Googling on Alpha. I would encourage you to think about the paradigm shifts that are part of your own work and challenge them and see where we're going to go next. A change is going to come. Have a good one.